The Rhine is behind us. The air in Germany smells different, not just of gunpowder, but of damp cellars and unspoken fear. We were told we'd be fighting fanatics to the last man, house by house. Instead, we find ghosts, faces in shattered windows, gaunt and gray, flinching from the rumble of our tanks. They were promised a monster, a barbarian from across the sea. They look at our rifles, our helmets, but mostly they look at our hands. What they don't know is that the most powerful weapon we carry now isn't made of steel. The propaganda machine of the Third Reich had worked for over a decade, but its final, most desperate project was the creation of a terrifying caricature, the American soldier. He was painted as a degenerate, a criminal unleashed from the prisons of the New World, devoid of culture and morality. Joseph Goebbels' ministry assured the German people that the GI would bring not liberation, but annihilation. They were told to expect plunder, destruction, and unspeakable violence against women and children. This narrative was hammered home with chilling intensity as Allied armies crossed the border in the spring of 1945. The result was a nation holding its breath, cowering in basements and bombed-out churches awaiting the apocalypse. For the average German civilian, the rumble of a Sherman tank was not the sound of the war ending, but the sound of their world being torn apart by vengeful monsters. For the men of the 1st and 3rd United States armies, this was a surreal new phase of the war. They had battled their way from the beaches of Normandy, through the hedgerows of France and the frozen forests of Belgium. They were veterans of brutal, relentless combat. They had been trained to fight an army, but now they faced a nation of shadows. Every village they entered was a silent testament to the Reich's collapse. There were no cheering crowds as there had been in Paris or Brussels. There was only an unnerving quiet, punctuated by the crunch of rubble under their boots. The German infrastructure had not just been damaged, it had disintegrated. Food distribution networks, the arteries of a modern state, had been severed. The result was a slow, creeping famine that gnawed at the heart of the country. People were subsisting on watery soups made from scavenged weeds, on hoarded potatoes that were more rot than substance. Starvation had become the silent, final defender of the Reich. This was the landscape of the enemy's homeland, a place of profound contradictions. Soldiers who had been primed for a vicious, last-ditch defense found themselves policing streets where the greatest threat was desperation. The official policy was non-fraternization, a stark line drawn between victor and vanquished. But policy is an abstract thing, and a starving child is a concrete reality. Diaries and letters home from this period are filled with a sense of disorientation. One soldier from Ohio wrote of seeing children with the hollow eyes and swollen bellies he had only ever seen in missionary pamphlets. Another described the almost animalistic way civilians would scramble for a discarded C-ration tin just to lick the remnants from the inside. This was not the master race they had been told about. This was a population on its knees. It is in this crucible of hunger and fear that the most potent weapon of the Allied advance was truly deployed. It was not a new type of tank or a more powerful artillery piece. It was a canteen of water, a bar of chocolate, a spoonful of stew from a mobile field kitchen. Consider one such encounter, repeated in countless variations across the crumbling front. An infantry squad moves cautiously down a street that is more canyon than thoroughfare, flanked by the skeletal remains of apartment buildings. The men are tense, their eyes scanning every dark window, every pile of debris that could conceal a sniper or a Panzerfaust team. Suddenly, A figure stumbles from a doorway. Not a soldier, but a woman, her face a pale mask of exhaustion. She takes a few faltering steps and then, without a sound, collapses onto the cobblestones. The soldiers freeze. Is it a trap? A trick? One GI, a kid barely out of his teens from a farm in Iowa, breaks formation. He kneels beside her, unslings his canteen, and gently lifts her head. This single, simple action is a direct assault on years of Nazi propaganda. It is an event that carries more weight than 1,000 bomber raid, because it is an undeniable truth, witnessed not on a newsreel, but in the flesh. It is the beginning of the end of the war, not in the halls of power, but on a broken street in a forgotten German town. The water offered by that young infantryman was more than just hydration. It was a counter-narrative. In that moment, the entire ideological structure of Nazi resistance began to crumble, not from the force of an explosion, but from the quiet weight of a simple, undeniable truth. The woman, and those who watched from the shadows, did not see a monster. They saw a man. And that realization was more devastating to the Nazi cause than a lost battle. This was not an isolated incident. Across the American zones of occupation, similar scenes played out with remarkable consistency. These were not choreographed events or part of a formal psychological operations campaign. They were spontaneous, human reactions to overwhelming suffering. The GIs of 1945 were hardened combat veterans, but they were not the brutes of Goebbels' propaganda. They were products of a society that, for all its flaws, still valued individual dignity. For them, the war had been against a military and an ideology, not against starving civilians. The diaries of men from both the First and Third Armies speak to this repeatedly. They describe the official orders for non-fraternization, and then, in the next sentence, detail how they accidentally left extra cans of rations on a wall or gave chocolate to children with pleading eyes. Army field kitchens became focal points of this unofficial policy. After the troops had been fed, whatever was left in the large vats, stew, coffee, powdered eggs, was often ladled out to lines of German women and elderly men who would appear with a heartbreaking collection of tins, jars, and chipped bowls. A mess sergeant from Patton's Third Army, a man who had orchestrated logistics for armored spearheads, now found his most important job was managing the distribution of leftovers to a hungry populace. This quiet campaign of compassion had a profound strategic effect. It systematically defanged the Nazi narrative. How could a civilian be convinced to fight to the death against a barbarian who had just given their child a piece of candy? How could the party's lies about Allied cruelty hold up against the evidence of a medic tending to a German elder's wounds? Each act of kindness was a pebble dropped into a still pond, sending ripples of truth through a community that had been submerged in lies. It preempted the kind of desperate, last-ditch partisan warfare that the Nazi leadership had hoped to inspire. Instead of fighting for a phantom ideology, the German people began to focus on the immediate, tangible reality of survival. A survival that was now being aided, not threatened, by the American presence. The conquerors were behaving not as vengeful gods, but as reluctant custodians. This was the final, unexpected battle of the European War. It wasn't fought with tanks in a shattered city or with bombers in the sky. It was fought in the space between two people. It was a contest between an ideology of absolute hatred and the simple, enduring power of human empathy. And empathy won. The surrender signed in a schoolhouse in Reims on May 7th, 1945, was a formality. The real surrender had already been happening for weeks, on thousands of street corners, in countless small exchanges. It was a surrender of fear to hope, of propaganda to reality. The Great War in Europe was concluded not only by the force of arms that crushed the Third Reich's armies, but by the force of character that dismantled its lies. The American G.I. had arrived as a soldier, but his most lasting victory was achieved as a human being.